The city had a habit of waking up tired. Mornings were born slowly, draped in a golden veil of mist, and nights almost always seemed to hold a secret. I used to walk those streets trying not to be noticed, my crumpled lab coat, my earphones silent, and my mind still tethered to the stories of patients I'd left asleep behind hospital doors. Each one carried a pain that reminded me how unjust the world could be and, at the same time, how hope persisted in the most unlikely places. The rain that night was light, almost delicate but persistent. It had the sound of a memory that refuses to fade. The streetlights reflected in the puddles like small, shattered suns, and the wind carried the metallic scent of wet streets. I walked slowly, feeling the sweet weight of exhaustion and the quiet joy of being alive, even when everything around me seemed to breathe in a minor key. My name is Elena Torres, and no matter how hard I try, I can never explain how such an ordinary life was pulled into the heart of a story woven with power, fear, and redemption. It all began with something simple: a solitary walk, an instinctive choice, a glance that lingered 1 second too long. My backpack weighed heavily on my shoulder, stuffed with books and well-worn notebooks. Inside it were my small weapons against reality: nursing notes, dreams of saving lives, and the note my mother always tucked into my lunch: proud of you. It was the kind of quiet love that sustained who I was. She worked at 2 clinics, exhausted but smiling, saying every shift was a seed planted for the future I deserved. The hospital was 4 blocks away, and the neighborhood, though beautiful by day, hid at night what no one wanted to see. I knew that. And yet, something in me liked the damp solitude of those early mornings. The distant sound of cars, the calm rhythm of traffic lights changing colors, the scent of asphalt after the rain. It was the only time I felt the city belonged to me. But that night, something broke the harmony of routine. As I crossed the street in front of a luxurious restaurant, I heard a dull thud, a muffled sound of struggle. A glass bottle fell and shattered on the sidewalk. I looked instinctively and saw a young man being shoved into a black van. 2 men held his arms, and a third pointed a short, metallic, cold gun under the streetlights. The young man's body resisted, but his desperation was futile. The people around pretended not to see. A couple quickened their pace, a waiter turned his back, and a driver honked irritably, as if it were just another urban inconvenience. The city had learned to ignore what it feared. I froze. For a moment, I thought about running, calling for help, but my legs didn't respond. Only my heart pounded, loud, as if it wanted to leap out of my chest. The van sped off in seconds, tires screeching around the corner, leaving behind the echo of rubber and the smell of smoke. On the ground, something blinked. A phone, dropped and vibrating, its screen illuminating the asphalt. The hand of the security guard who had tried to intervene lay nearby, motionless. I approached slowly, fear pushing me forward and curiosity pulling me back. I picked up the phone. On the screen, the name Marco Moretti pulsed insistently. Before I could decide what to do, the phone rang again. The sound seemed to slice through the air, cold, relentless. I answered without thinking. Hello? My voice came out shaky, almost inaudible. On the other end, a deep voice replied, unhurried. Where are you? The question carried something more than mere curiosity. It was a command. His breathing was steady, his tone calculated. I hesitated. I explained that I'd witnessed a kidnapping, that I didn't know who was calling, that I'd only answered. But the man seemed to know more than he let on. Is the restaurant across from the university hospital? Yes, I replied, confused. Then stay there. Don't hang up. And the call ended. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had weight, as if the city itself were holding its breath. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted. Maybe the voice, or the name, Moretti. I'd heard that name in some news report, but I couldn't recall if it was tied to politics, business, or crime. All I knew was that it sent shivers down my spine. The minutes that followed dragged on endlessly. Then, the sound of powerful engines filled the avenue. 2 black cars appeared from opposite directions, blocking traffic. Men stepped out. Dark suits, serious expressions, calculated movements. The world seemed to slow down, and the fear, for some reason, turned into fascination. The center of the formation parted, and from it emerged a tall man with a steady gaze and an almost unreal presence. It wasn't the kind of strength imposed by violence, but by natural authority, the kind that makes others step back without a word. He walked as if he already knew the ending to every story. Adriano Moretti. The name cut through the air like a verdict. Someone whispered it, and the effect was immediate. The men moved in silence. The onlookers vanished. I stayed there, unsure whether to ask for help or explain myself. He saw me, and when his eyes met mine, I felt as though something inside me was being read categorized, and filed away in seconds. There was no kindness, no threat, just calculation. "Did you see my son?" The question was direct, no preamble. I nodded, stuttering. I told him what I saw. The men, the van, the direction they took. He listened in silence, his gaze locked on me, as if each word were a piece of a puzzle. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said only, "And now you're part of something you don't understand." That sentence fell on me like a verdict. I wanted to respond, but he had already turned away, ordering his men to secure the area. One of them took the phone from my hand, another asked me to wait in the car. Everything happened too quickly, as if fate had decided my life would change there, without consulting me. As the car sped off, I realized the city remained the same. The building lights flickered, drivers honked, and the world continued its course, indifferent. But for me, time had split in two, the before and the after of Adriano Moretti. I looked out the window and saw my reflection in the wet glass, pale, frightened, and yet strangely calm. It was as if I already knew there was no going back. The rain kept falling, washing the streets and erasing footprints. But some stories, I learned that night, don't wash away with the rain. They only begin. And it was there, amid the sound of engines and the chill of the early morning, that fate sealed mine. Before we continue, if this video is being helpful to you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. It really helps more people discover stories like this. In that moment, as the car vanished down the dark avenues, I felt the city breathing differently, as if it sensed something was about to change, and that I, Elena Torres, would be the invisible thread between innocence and power, between light and what hides behind it. The car moved in silence, cutting through the streets with the precision of a blade. Outside, the city lights seemed to flee from the glass, turning into fleeting golden streaks. Inside, the air was thick, as if silence itself had weight. I could hear only the low hum of the engine and the steady beat of my heart, trying to make sense of where I was being taken. The leather seat was too soft, the cologne too expensive, and the tension between us, almost palpable. Adriano Moretti sat beside me, motionless, staring out at the scenery. His profile seemed carved in stone, sharp jawline, distant gaze, impassive expression. Every gesture felt calculated, as if even breathing followed a strategy. I wanted to speak, but something told me silence was safer. Still, the questions simmered. Who was he, exactly? What would they do with me? Why, out of so many people, had I become part of this? He turned his face slowly toward me. His gaze pierced through me. "You work at Central University Hospital?" he asked, his voice deep, restrained. "Yes," I replied, trying not to tremble. "You're a nursing student?" I nodded. "And you decided to get involved in something that doesn't concern you." Those words cut deeper than he might have intended. I took a deep breath before answering. "I was just trying to help." He looked away, as if my response irritated and intrigued him at the same time. "In my world, those who try to help tend to die young." The sentence echoed like a verdict. We continued like that, trapped in tense silence, until the cars began climbing a winding road. The rain had lessened, but the sky was still heavy, and the city now looked small below, a mirage of lights and distant sounds. When the iron gate opened, I realized we were in front of something that didn't belong to the world I came from. The Moretti mansion loomed atop the hill, imposing and silent, surrounded by high walls and guards who seemed like shadows. The gate closed behind us with a metallic, decisive sound, as if reality had been locked out. Inside, everything exuded wealth and discipline. The marble floor reflected the golden light of chandeliers. Ancient paintings stared back with eyes from centuries past. The air smelled of polished wood and restrained power. Every step I took felt like trespassing on sacred, or cursed, ground. Adriano walked ahead without looking back, and I followed as if entering a labyrinth. We reached a large room with heavy curtains and a lit fireplace. He stopped in front of a table and made a simple gesture. "Sit." I obeyed. One of the men placed a cup in front of me. Steam rose slowly, fragrant, but my hands trembled too much to touch it. Adriano remained standing, observing me with the same gaze that examines a rare artifact, or a disguised threat. "Tell me what you saw." I tried to explain everything as clearly as possible. I spoke of leaving the hospital, the van, the armed men, the direction they took. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, he just listened. And that stillness was more frightening than any shout. When I finished, he stayed silent for a few seconds that felt like hours. Then he said, "You described details an ordinary observer wouldn't notice. Maybe because I'm trained to. Nurses learn to observe." A faint curl of his lips appeared, like an involuntary reflex of irony or admiration. Or maybe because you're too brave for your own good. I didn't know how to respond. And for the first time, I noticed something different in his expression. Beneath that armor of control, something stirred, a trace of exhaustion, of wounded humanity. He stepped back, leaning against the table. My son, Marco, is 19. He was coming back from college when they took him. Since I lost his mother, I swore nothing would happen to the boy. And yet, he vanished right in front of me. His voice, steady until then, wavered for a moment. So brief it was almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal the man behind the myth. I wanted to say something, anything to break that weight, but he slipped back into his impassive tone. You have two options, Elena. My name and his voice sounded different. Cold, but close. You can go back to your life and pretend this never happened, or stay and help me bring my son back. The words hung in the air, as if the choice had already been made. I knew what was sensible. Leave, forget everything, continue my studies, care for my mother. But something inside me, stubborn, irrational, perhaps reckless, wouldn't let me say no. I want to help. He stared at me, as if testing the truth of my response. Then he simply nodded. Then you're part of this now. The phrase, spoken calmly, felt more final than a vow. The night stretched on, and the hours that followed passed in flashes. Men coming and going, maps spread across the table, information exchanged in hushed tones. I stayed there, seated, trying to absorb this new universe. The way they moved was precise, almost military. No shouting, no chaos. Just discipline and power. The kind of power that doesn't flaunt itself but imposes. Between conversations, Adriano watched me. Sometimes he seemed to assess, other times just to understand. When I finally saw his shoulders relax, I realized something in him was starting to shift. Perhaps he saw in me not a threat, but an unexpected piece in his chess game. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, he stood and approached the window. The glass reflected the rain that had begun to fall again. Light, steady, like a repeat of the previous night. This city lives on secrets, Elena. Some are worth gold, others cost lives. Figuring out which is what separates the dead from the survivors. I looked at him, unsure how to respond. He turned, and for a moment his gaze softened. Rest. We start tomorrow. One of the guards led me to a room upstairs. The hallway was silent, and every door seemed to hide a mystery. When I was alone, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands, still trembling, still stained by rain and fear. Outside, the wind battered the windows, and the mansion seemed to breathe with me, alive, alert, impenetrable. I knew there was no going back. The simple life I'd known had been left behind, along with the hospital, the books, and the small dreams. Now, I was at the center of something beyond logic, a web of power, pain, and invisible loyalties. And though the fear was great, a secret spark burned silently within me. It was as if an ancient force, perhaps courage, perhaps fate, had decided I needed to be there, beside a man who moved the world with the weight of his gaze. That night, before closing my eyes, I realized something in me had changed too. It wasn't just my life taking a new course. It was me, being reshaped, without realizing it, by his presence. And in the dark, before sleep came, I thought of only one thing. Power isn't just what dominates. Sometimes it's what awakens what was dormant. The dawn arrived like a slow whisper over the hills. The sun, timid, filtered through the heavy curtains, painting the wood with golden hues. The mansion woke in silence, not the ordinary silence of large houses, but a disciplined silence, imposed, trained. There was an invisible rhythm to everything, as if even the light needed permission to enter. It took me a few moments to realize where I was. The white walls, the faint scent of lavender, the cool sheets. For a second, I thought I'd dreamed the previous night. But then I heard footsteps in the hallway, steady, confident, and reality returned in full. I was in the Moretti house. I got up slowly, trying to order my thoughts. The clothes left for me on the chair were simple but new. On the table, a steaming coffee waited, beside a note written in firm handwriting. Come down when you're ready. I took a deep breath. Every gesture felt heavier than it should. I descended the stairs carefully, observing everything around me. The walls displayed ancient paintings, scenes of harbors, stormy seas, men and women seemingly immortalized in invisible battles. In the main hall, 2 guards spoke quietly, and a woman with her hair tied back arranged flowers in a crystal vase. That place had the beauty of a museum and the rigidity of a barracks. The air smelled of coffee, metal, and something I could only call power. When I reached the main room, Adriano was already there, Seated at a long table covered with scattered documents, he read something intently. Upon seeing me, he gave a slight nod. No words. His voice came later, firm as always. "Sit, Elena." I obeyed. He looked up, and for a moment there was no coldness in his eyes, just a deep exhaustion, the kind that builds in people who carry more than they should. "Did you sleep well?" "As well as I could," I replied. He nodded. "Today we work." The word work sounded strange in that context, but I didn't ask what it meant. Adriano handed me a folder with photos, reports, maps. "Everything we have so far," he said. The van had been last seen near the old port. Then it vanished. As he spoke, I observed his movements. Every gesture, every pause, every glance seemed calculated. He didn't waste time with explanations, only said what was essential. It was like watching someone accustomed to commanding armies without raising his voice. "Who are these people?" I asked, pointing to a photo. "Men who once stood by my side," he replied. "Some still do, others I don't know." The way he said "I don't know" made me understand that, in that world, uncertainty could be deadly. As the day went on, I realized that house wasn't just a home, it was the heart of an invisible network. Men in suits came and went carrying briefcases, phones vibrated on marble tables, and the air pulsed with information I'd never fully grasp. But amid all the restrained noise, there was something stronger, the sound of a father's worry. Adriano spent hours in front of screens with camera footage, digital maps, reports. Sometimes he forgot to eat. His eyes, usually hard, softened for seconds when he looked at Marco's photo on his phone. A smiling boy with dark hair and an open gaze, reminiscent of his father's lost innocence. Watching that man was like observing a volcano under ice. Nothing about him was truly calm, only contained. Early that evening, he called me to the library. The room was vast, lined with shelves up to the ceiling. The fire crackled in the hearth, and shadows danced on the walls. "Do you like to read?" he asked, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "Yes," I replied, surprised by the shift in tone. "I used to as well, before all this." He sat across from me, elbows on his knees, his gaze lost for a moment. He spoke then of his wife. Her name was Isabella. She died 7 years ago in a car accident that was never fully explained. "After that," he said, "I learned that even love can be used as a weapon." There was a long silence, the kind that doesn't disturb but weighs heavily. He asked about my mother, the hospital, what kept me going. I spoke of night shifts, the hope of paying for my studies, the constant fear of failing. He listened in silence, as if collecting fragments of a life he'd forgotten was simple. That conversation, improbable, almost impossible, created something between us that couldn't be named. Not trust, not affection. Perhaps just the recognition that we both carried absences time couldn't mend. In the days that followed, I began to understand the Moretti routine. Mornings were for information, afternoons for strategy. The guards rotated in silent shifts, and the staff moved like clockwork. Everything revolved around Adriano, and he, around his son's absence. But behind all that control, I saw something more. Fear. Not the fear of losing power, but the fear of losing what remained of his humanity. One afternoon, when I saw him alone in the garden, staring at the rain-soaked rose bushes, I realized that man, the one who made the city tremble with his name, was just someone trying to remember what it felt like to feel. And perhaps that's why he let me stay. The presence of a stranger in the Moretti house was a risk, and everyone knew it, but no one dared question his decision. Some looked at me with suspicion, others with pity. I, in turn, felt trapped in something I didn't understand, and paradoxically, more alive than ever. One night, he called me back to the library. The fire burned low, and the rain tapped the windows like impatient fingers. "You could have left, Elena. Why did you stay?" "Because I saw the fear in your eyes, and because no one deserves to lose a son." He didn't respond. He just nodded, with a look that said more than any words. That was the first moment I felt the ice begin to crack. Days later, news arrived. A lead. The van had been spotted near the port, just as he'd suspected. Adriano didn't celebrate. He only said, "It's a start." And as he prepared his men, I realized I was increasingly involved. It wasn't just empathy or curiosity. It was something deeper. The feeling that fate had pushed me there, not by chance, but to witness a transformation that hadn't even begun. By the end of that week, as I crossed the hallway and saw him standing by the window, his silhouette framed against the cold light of dawn, I realized his power didn't come solely from the fear he inspired. It came from the love he tried to hide, and, as impossible as it seemed, that love, wounded, silent, hardened, was beginning to reach me too. The days that followed were marked by a growing tension. the kind of invisible energy that settles into the corners of a house before something happens. The air felt heavier, the men's steps more hurried, and even the distant sound of the gates closing carried an ominous tone. I could already sense the rhythm of that life, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the glances exchanged between the guards, the murmur of names I wasn't yet supposed to know. Adriano spent hours locked in his office, analyzing reports and footage from cameras across the city. When he emerged, his face was a mix of contained anger and determination. Sometimes I watched him from afar, trying to decipher what lay behind that absolute self-control. With each day, he seemed more human, and precisely because of that, more dangerous. That morning, I was summoned by one of his assistants, Vittorio, a man with a cold demeanor and overly polite manners. Mr. Moretti asked you to join the meeting, he said. His tone was respectful, but there was something in his gaze that made it clear my presence was an exception, one that bothered him. When I entered the room, the atmosphere was tense. Maps and photographs covered the central table. Empty coffee cups betrayed hours of waiting. Adriano stood beside a burly man with a graying beard and a shrewd look. Vittorio whispered, Enzo Falcone. I'd heard that name in the staff's conversations. He was Adriano's closest advisor, a man who'd been with him since the Moretti Empire was just a spark. His loyalty was legendary, and precisely because of that, something in his gaze unsettled me. Adriano began speaking, pointing to the map. The van was tracked to the old port. Then it disappeared at the San Pietro docks. We believe the group responsible is tied to the Russo family. The name was met with silence. Even I, who knew nothing of that underworld, felt the weight it carried. They want control of the port, Enzo explained, and they knew the boy was the weak point. Adriano looked at him firmly. Don't underestimate what's mine, Enzo. There was a moment when the air seemed to stop. The tension between them wasn't new, I realized. There was something unspoken, a subtle but real crack. When the meeting ended, Adriano pulled me aside. You still work at the hospital, right? Yes. I need eyes there. One of the Russo family's wounded will show up any moment now. I want to know when it happens. The idea seemed absurd, dangerous, but he spoke as if asking for something trivial. And before I could think, I was already agreeing. That night, back at the hospital, the city felt different. The cold lights of the corridors, the smells of antiseptic and stale coffee, the metallic clinks of stretchers, everything now carried a new meaning. I walked with a weight in my chest, knowing I was crossing an invisible line between what was right and what was necessary. Around 3 a.m, a man arrived at the emergency room with a gunshot wound. He claimed it was from a robbery, but the hospital's security, discreet and accustomed, avoided asking questions. I recognized him from one of the photos, one of the Russo family's henchmen. While the doctor tended to him, I sent an encrypted message to the number Adriano had given me. We've got one of them. Wounded, Central Hospital. The reply came minutes later, short and cold. Get out of there, now. But it was too late. The man on the stretcher opened his eyes and stared at me, a look that seemed to know. Fear hit me like a wave. I ran to the locker room, changed clothes, and slipped out through the back, my heart racing. It was raining, as it always did when something changed. In the parking lot, a black car was waiting. Vittorio opened the door without a word. Back at the mansion, Adriano was waiting in the living room. He was different, the usual calm replaced by a restrained nervousness. You exposed yourself too much, he said. I did what you asked. And now they know about you. That sentence hit harder than any threat. I had crossed the point of no return. The following days were spent preparing. Adriano and his men were planning a rescue, and I, against all logic, was part of it. He trusted my observations, the small details I noticed that escaped eyes accustomed to violence. But something, inside and outside the house, began to shift. Conversations grew shorter, glances more suspicious. Enzo's presence, always constant, now seemed cloaked in shadows. He spoke little, observed too much. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with something that wasn't exactly hostility. It was calculation. On a rainy night, as I walked through the corridors, I heard voices behind a half-open door. It was Enzo and one of Adriano's men. The words came in fragments. Move up the attack, before he realizes, the kid is worth more alive. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I understood in that moment that something was about to go wrong. I ran to the office, but Adriano wasn't there. Vittorio found me in the hallway, confused. The plans changed, he said. They're acting now. Now? Enzo said it was the boss's orders, but I knew it wasn't. Chaos followed. Armed men running through the corridors, cars speeding off, orders shouted amid static and the storm. I tried to find Adriano, but one of the guards pushed me out. The night shattered into gunfire. In the confusion, someone grabbed my arm. A blow to the back of my head. The world spun. My vision darkened. The last sound I heard was tires screeching and the roar of the rain. When I woke, I was in a cold, damp place. My hands tied, the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. The distant sound of the sea crashing against rusted structures echoed. I had been taken, and at some point that night, Adriano Moretti realized that not only had his son been kidnapped, but also the only person who dared to look at him without fear. And that, this time, the betrayal came from within his own house. The first thing I felt was the cold, a damp cold seeping from the floor, the walls, the very air. When I opened my eyes, darkness wrapped around me like a second skin. The windows were boarded up, with only a sliver of light creeping in from somewhere far off. The smell was a mix of salt, rust, and gasoline. I heard the rhythmic sound of water hitting metal structures and realized we were near the sea. My hands, tied behind my back, ached, and my bound ankles kept me from moving. The taste of blood in my mouth betrayed the blow I'd received. I tried to recall the exact sequence of events, but my memory came in fragments. The mansion in chaos, muffled shouts, the rain, the glare of headlights. Then, darkness. The voice came first, before the figure. "So it's you, the nurse." A tall man with disheveled hair lit a cigarette in the corner. The orange glow partially revealed his face, the same one I'd recognized from the photos Adriano had shown me. Russo. "Pretty, brave, stupid," he said, exhaling the smoke slowly. "You should have run when you had the chance." I stayed silent. He smiled. "Your boss will come, and when he does, he'll bring hell with him. That's what I want." The sound of his boots fading away was the prelude to the silence that settled back in. Time lost its shape there. Sometimes I heard voices in other rooms, sometimes just the creak of metal, the drip of water. Every second felt like a reminder of the distance separating me from the world, and from Adriano. It was during one of those dead hours that I heard something different. A lighter sound, a nearby breath. I looked to the opposite corner of the warehouse and saw, tied up, a boy. His face was swollen, his gaze confused. "Marco." My heart stopped for a moment. "Marco," I whispered. He heard me and lifted his face with effort. "Who are you?" "I'm Elena. Your father sent me to help." His eyes flickered, a mix of hope and disbelief. "Is he coming?" "He is." I wasn't sure, but I said it like a vow. From that moment, time became an enemy to be defeated. I needed to keep the boy awake, lucid, breathing. The ropes binding us were thick, but one of my hands could move just enough to brush against a jagged metal splinter on the floor. I spent hours rubbing the knot against it until I felt the heat of torn skin, and the rope finally gave way. Outside, the sound of engines roared like thunder. A bang, then another. Shouts. The echo of gunfire tearing through the night. Hell had begun. The door was kicked open in a single blow, the air filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Men in black advanced with military precision. I heard his voice before I saw him, the same voice that days ago had changed my fate. "She's here!" Adriano Moretti cut through the smoke like a living shadow. His gaze was that of a man who had crossed hell to get there. Blood on his face, ragged breathing, but his posture, unbroken. He ran to me, cut my ropes with a pocket knife, and without hesitation, held my face in his hands. "Are you okay?" I nodded, tears mixing with the dust. "And the kid?" "There," I pointed. He turned and ran to his son. The touch he gave Marco was brief, but laden with a tenderness that needed no words. "Let's get out of here." As gunfire echoed outside, Adriano lifted his son into his arms. I followed, my body trembling, my heart racing. The factory was a maze of shadows and flickering lights. Every corridor seemed to promise an ambush. Every step a battle against fear. That's when he saw him, Enzo. The former advisor stood at the exit, a gun in hand. His face was calm, almost serene, as if everything had already been decided. "Why, Enzo?" Adriano asked, his voice heavy with something that wasn't hatred. It was disappointment. "Because you forgot who built you. I made you king, Adriano, and now I want the throne." The sound of the shot rang out before the reply. Adriano staggered, but the vest absorbed part of the impact. Fury took shape. He lunged at Enzo, disarming him with a swift blow. The metallic clank of the gun hitting the floor mingled with the roar of the sea outside. The fight between them was short, brutal, unglorious. It was more than a battle. It was the end of a brotherhood. In the end, Adriano held his former friend by the collar, fist raised, blood dripping, but something in him hesitated. "Kill me," And this all ends, Enzo taunted. Adriano stared at him for long seconds, his chest heaving. Then, he lowered his fist. No, you'll live, and you'll carry the weight of what you destroyed. He let him fall to the ground, defeated, and turned to me and Marco. Let's go. We stepped out into heavy rain, the sky cracking with thunder. Men fell, others retreated. The sound of the sea mixed with groans and shouts. With every step, I felt the ground tremble, not just from the conflict, but from the sense that something within him was crumbling too. When we finally reached the car, Adriano pushed me in first, then his son. A final shot cut through the air. He turned instinctively, shielding us. The dull thud was followed by the warmth of blood on my hand. Adriano! I screamed. He fell to his knees, breathing heavily. I'm fine, he lied, trying to stay in control. Marco was crying, and I, caught between panic and adrenaline, pressed on the wound. You're going to be okay. I need you to be. The car sped off, taking us away from that inferno. Outside, the factory burned, the fire reflecting on the sea, as if the sky itself were being purified. Adriano leaned his head back, eyes half closed. Is he safe? He asked. Yes. He smiled, exhausted, and murmured, then it was worth it. I rested my head on his shoulder, and for the first time since I'd met him, I realized his power wasn't what made him great. It was the love that drove him, even when it hurt. The car raced through the road under relentless rain. Outside, the city slept, oblivious to the war that had just been fought on its edges. And as the engine roared, I understood that somewhere between fear and courage, something new was born. Not a victory, but a quiet redemption. The criminal bled, the innocent healed, and the boy slept in the back seat. 3 fates intertwined by the night, by pain, and by the unexpected tenderness of those who, against all odds, had survived. The next morning dawned gray, with the scent of sea salt and smoke still lingering on the horizon. The sun tried to pierce the clouds, but the world seemed too weary to be illuminated. The car that had brought us from the factory stopped in front of a private hospital, far from the city center. Marco slept, and Adriano, pale, let the blood dry on his shirt. Don't say anything, he murmured before getting out. Just take care of him. I did what I knew how to do, held the wounded body and led him inside, ignoring curious glances and questions. Inside, the cold, sterile routine clashed brutally with the violence of the previous night. The white corridors, the beeps of heart monitors, the smell of disinfectant. It was the world I knew, but one I somehow felt exiled from. While the doctors tended to him, I stayed outside, my hands dirty and my soul trembling. Marco woke a few hours later, confused, searching for his father with his eyes. Is he going to be okay? He asked. He will, I replied. But my voice didn't sound like truth. It sounded like faith. Adriano spent 2 days under observation. When I finally saw him awake, his usual rigidity was gone. He seemed smaller, more human, as if the pain had dismantled the defenses that power had built over the years. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but there was something new in them, a tired, almost gentle serenity. You stayed? He said, his voice hoarse. I said I would. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Sometimes presence is the only possible comfort. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he asked to be allowed to walk a little. The guards tried to stop him, but he raised a hand, and they all obeyed. That's how we left the hospital together, with the cold sea breeze touching our faces. I spent half my life believing I could control everything, he said, looking at the horizon. But power doesn't protect anyone. It just delays the inevitable. I looked at him, trying to discern where the man ended and the myth began. Adriano Moretti, the name that made men bow and enemies vanish, was now just a father who had nearly lost everything. And what will you do now? I asked. He took a deep breath, gazing at the sea. Give up what's left. I thought it was a metaphor, but that same week, Adriano Moretti called his lawyer. He decided to surrender part of his empire, the warehouses, the contracts, the ships, not out of sudden remorse, but because he understood that the legacy he'd leave for Marco couldn't be built on fear. The news spread quickly. The papers wrote that the king of the port had struck a deal with the authorities. None of them understood that. Behind the headlines, there was an act of surrender, and perhaps of love. His allies scattered. Some fled, others betrayed him. Enzo vanished, and no one looked for him. The house on the hill was emptied little by little. The marble lost its shine. The silence gained an echo. I returned to work at the hospital, but something in me no longer fit that routine. Every patient, every act of care, every touch of a hand seemed to carry a new awareness. That life is fragile, and that, sometimes, a simple act of compassion can change the course of something greater than ourselves. A month later, I got a call. It was him. His voice sounded lighter, almost unfamiliar. "Meet me at the Marina Cafe," he said. I went. The place was simple, with weathered wood and the smell of fresh bread. Adriano was sitting by the window. No guards, no kingly posture. He wore a white shirt, his gray hair carelessly combed. When he saw me, he smiled, and that small gesture carried more redemption than any confession. "How's Marco?" I asked. "Better. He's studying, trying to figure out what to do with his life. Says he wants to be a doctor." I smiled. Maybe he was inspired by the nurse who saved him. "Maybe?" he replied, his gaze fixed on the steaming coffee. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the sea in the distance. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You were the reminder I needed, Elena, that there was still something good worth saving." My heart tightened. There was no more fear between us, just gratitude, and a tenderness that asked for nothing in return. He looked out at the setting sun. "You know what's hardest, Elena? It's not the crime. It's forgiveness. And mine began when you showed up on that street." I wanted to say something, but no words fit. The silence, once again, said it all. In the days that followed, he continued dismantling his empire. Old allies called him crazy. Enemies called him a coward. But those who truly knew him, and I was beginning to, knew it wasn't weakness. It was liberation. The man who once believed he controlled fate was now learning to accept the unpredictable. And deep down, I understood that his redemption didn't come from punishment, but from choice. The hardest judgment is always the one we face in the mirror. The city moved on, indifferent as always. But for those who looked closely, the name Moretti ceased to be a whisper of fear, and became a memory of a time that was ending. And beneath all that surface of power and pain, something unexpected was born, a timid but true peace. That night, back in my room, I wrote in my diary, "Justice, sometimes, isn't about punishing, but about understanding. And love is the only possible form of absolution." Adriano Moretti was beginning to understand that. And somehow, so was I. Time passed with the gentleness of something that no longer needs to rush. Months later, the sound of the sea replaced the wail of sirens, and the wind became a constant companion, the kind that seems to cleanse both the air and the soul. I never returned to that house on the hill. They said it had been sold, then demolished. Perhaps that was only fair. Some stories need ruins, so others can be born. It was Marco who wrote to me first. A brief message, with hurried letters but full of life. "We're okay. Dad asked me to say thank you." I read those words over and over like reading a prayer. One day, I accepted the invitation implied in that gratitude. I traveled to the coast where they had hidden, or perhaps found themselves. The road was long, flanked by hills and patches of forest, until, at the end, the sea appeared, vast, blue, and silent. The house stood there, isolated, facing the horizon, simple, white wood, with curtains dancing in the breeze and the smell of freshly baked bread. When I stepped out of the car, Adriano was on the porch. He looked like another man. His now gray hair matched the calm in his eyes, those of someone who had finally made peace with his own name. No suit, no escort, no trace of power. Just him, the sea, and a silence that no longer threatened. "You came," he said, his voice almost an embrace. I smiled. No need to explain. Marco appeared soon after, with the same smile from the photo I kept in my memory. Only now, there was peace instead of fear. He was stronger, taller, holding a small toolbox. "I'm fixing the boat," he said, laughing. "Dad wants to learn how to fish." The simplicity of that sentence unraveled me inside. The man who once controlled empires was now trying to master only the sea. I stayed there for a few days. Mornings began with the sound of seagulls, and nights ended with the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Neither of them spoke about the past, but it was present. Not as a wound, but as a reminder. Adriano had become a man of small, steady gestures, brewing coffee, helping his son with the nets, walking barefoot on the sand. It was strange to see such greatness contained in something so simple. One afternoon, he called me out to the porch. The sun was beginning to set. The sky split between shades of copper and violet. The breeze carried the salt of the sea and the promise of a calm night. He handed me a mug of tea and stood beside me in silence for a while. "Do you believe in redemption, Elena?" I thought before answering. "I believe in new beginnings, and that some only come after we've lost everything." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When it all ended, I thought my life was over. But then, there was that night, that street, that voice on the phone, and it was like something pulled me back. I looked at him. "You pulled yourself back. I was just there." A faint smile crossed his face. A rare smile, as if time had given him back the right to feel. "There's no redemption without witnesses," he said, turning to me. "And you were mine." His words pierced me with an unexpected sweetness. There was no more pain, no guilt, no shadows. Just the raw, simple, peaceful truth of two human beings who had survived the impossible. That night, we dined together. The table was small but full of meaning. Warm bread, simple wine, Marco's laughter filling the air. Laughter, that forgotten sound, returned there, timid at first, then sincere. As we talked, I noticed something quiet unfolding. The Moretti table, once a symbol of power and distance, was now a home. No gold, no guards, no luxury, just the abundance of being alive. Later, when the sky had become a blanket of stars, Adriano called me to the porch again. The wind swayed the curtains, and the sea breathed in long, calm waves. He stood there for a moment, looking at the vast darkness ahead, then spoke. "I don't know if I deserve all this." "Deserving isn't the point," I replied. "You chose to live differently. That's enough." He turned to me, and for a moment our eyes met. No guilt, no secrets, just gratitude. The kind of look that promises nothing and, because of that, says everything. Marco appeared at the door, sleepy, calling for his father. Adriano smiled and went inside with him, his arm resting on his son's shoulders. I stayed there, alone, watching the moon's reflection on the sea. I thought about everything we'd been through, everything we'd lost, and realized that, at its core, this story wasn't about the mafia, revenge, or power. It was about the possibility, remote but real, that even the most wounded hearts can learn to beat in the rhythm of life again. In that moment, I felt the breeze touch my face and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, there was no fear. There was only the sound of the sea and a quiet certainty. Some stories don't end with applause or tragedy. They simply continue quietly in a new rhythm. The man who once ruled the shadows now walked in the light. The boy who had been a hostage to violence was now learning to be free. And I, who was just passing through, left a part of myself in that place, not as a nurse, nor as a witness, but as a living reminder that hope, even when silent, is a form of courage. And so, between the wind and the salt, between memory and forgetting, I understood that a new beginning always comes, even when the night feels too long. If this story touched you, write in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what keeps stories of courage, loyalty, and love alive in dark times.